welcome to another episode of Bridge the Channel, the final episode of 2022, and what a year it has been for EU politics, for British politics, for the transatlantic relationship, and for pretty much all the topics that our video series is discussing. There's still ongoing news as we speak. The major piece of news, of course, is that a communication satellite orbiting space was pushed off course after it was hit by the ball after the second hurricane penalty against France. That was a football joke for those of you who follow football. We will actually touch upon a bit on the Qatar World Cup and yet another England inglorious exit at the quarters against France, and we'll also see some interesting piece of news about British foreign policy, which may actually mean that the UK and the EU might start aligning more on the international stage than what all the Brexit disruption might suggest. So quite a few pieces of news to discuss as we wind down the year and we're getting ready for the Christmas season. Let's go see what we have for you in this episode. So the day that we're recording this today just happens to be the 3-year anniversary from the 2019 election when Boris Johnson, if you remember that guy, won an 80-seat majority and everything just seemed to be leading towards another 10 years of Brexit conservative dominance in British politics. Of course, it's crazy to think that in these 3 years, this parliament has voted Brexit, all kinds of pandemic laws, lockdowns, has changed 3 prime ministers. And what's almost crazy is that this parliament still has 2 more years to go. It's definitely been the 3 longest political years that most of us have experienced here in London. Of course, the mood has really changed for the country around after all those 3 years. The day that we're recording this today also happens to be the day when massive waves of strikes around the country start, with transportation in the health service and many other parts of the economy and life. It is a strange mood here as we're heading towards Christmas, and I would say it's a mood of resignation. There's not so much an active anger against the way things are, as much as people not feeling that they can do much about the way things are. As I said, feeling that there's 2 more years of this parliament that was elected in a completely different reality 3 years ago does make people feel a bit resigned about their fate. And I think this was also seen in the reactions to the England losing to France in the quarterfinals of the World Cup. Contrary to other exits of England from various football competitions, and all the years that I've been living here in London, I've actually experienced quite a few, this one was the one that felt the most subdued. People almost accepted it as a matter of fate, as something that was bound to happen anyway. I think this captures a lot the mood in the UK as well. People just want to be done with the World Cup, just want to be done with the Christmas period, just want to be done with this year and just see what life will look like after winter. Inflation, energy shortages, food shortages in the supermarkets, and strikes. It is really a winter of discontent, just not a very angry discontent, just a kind of sense of drift. I think it's something that exists in other parts of Europe as well, but it's really, really palpable here in the UK. So 2022 is leaving us, and without really much happiness and without really much hope, without really much else, just a sense of emptiness in a way. So the previous segment was a bit too existentialist, so let's now move more to practical policy. And I want to talk a bit about British foreign policy, because in the last few weeks there have been some interesting changes of emphasis, focus and nuance in the way the current government, the new government of Rishi Sunak, talks about foreign policy. And this is quite interesting, perhaps, about how things will unfold in coming months. First of all, I'd like to remind you that Rishi Sunak campaigned in the Conservative leadership election last summer on a strong anti-China line, which at the time seemed to be the mainstream position inside the Conservative Party. Both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were also strongly anti-China, anti-Putin, a very kind of strong pro-Western stance. However, in recent weeks, Sunak has spoken more about the need to engage China as what he calls a systemic challenge. This means that he's moving slowly away from the rhetoric of a new Cold War, which is what what particularly Liz Truss was talking about, and thinking more about ways to engage China, particularly in economics. So it's not only austerity that the current government of Rishi Sunak is doing, but it's also this more pragmatic approach towards China that was really the big signal of the Conservatives when they came to power more than 10 years ago under Cameron and Osborne. That government really was very high on engaging China for economic reasons, and this current government also knows that the economic situation of the UK necessitates a closer relationship on some issues with China. Parallel to that, the British Foreign Secretary in recent days has spoken a lot about the need for the UK to engage selectively but deeply a group of important countries around the world. He's spoken about around 20 to 30 strong bilateral relations around the world. Again, this shows that British foreign policy realizes that it cannot be global Britain, that it was too much of an ambition, that it has to be more pragmatic in focusing on some relations. Crucially, those relations do not include only democracies. The British Foreign Secretary has been questioned a lot about the engagement with Saudi Arabia, for example. The British Foreign Secretary has pushed back and has said in the current context, a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia is absolutely vital for the UK. Again, we see much more pragmatism here, not so much talk about human rights and values, but actually being a bit more pragmatic in engaging non-Western powers. And why I think this is important for Europe is that because I think we slowly see the UK moving towards a more nuanced perspective in its foreign policy, actually trying to do exactly what the EU is trying to do, trying to create a bit of a breathing room for itself in between this new Cold War mentality that exists between the US and China. Now, of course, we can expect the UK to always stay much closer aligned to the transatlantic framework, but I think it's still quite important that the UK appears conscious of the fact that it cannot all be just the US versus China competition, that actually countries such as the UK and Europe as a whole should be able to find a bit of a in-between ground between those two sides in areas that concern them, particularly in economic relations. I think this creates some openings for some interesting alignments between the UK and the EU in times to come. It's definitely something for Brussels to keep an eye on. So this was another episode of Bridge the Channel. We got a bit too deep and existential at some points. But, you know, it's the end of the year. It's time for all of us to take stock of how this year went along. I think it was a pretty good year for Bridge the Channel, not necessarily for the topics that Bridge the Channel covers. So we will be with you again early next year. Until we meet again in 2023, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, I guess, and take care.